Well, welcome back. I've heard there's been some very interesting discussions this morning, technologies discussions and all sorts. So I'm looking forward to the second two sessions of the afternoon. And the aim of this first one, I should actually introduce myself properly. I cover climate and energy policy in Brussels for the Financial Times. So the aim of this session is to dive into some of the development of rules and regulations in the CDR area. Is that helping or hindering growth? How current policies are shaping up? All these kind of things. And I'm delighted that I'm joined by a panel of eminent experts here to guide us through that. I've got all my names in totally the wrong order. So Alexandre Paquot, who's Director in Climate Action at the European Commission. Katie Lebling at the World Resources Institute Climate Programme. Rodica Avornic, who is the Associate Policy Director at the NGO Carbon Gap. David Thing, Business Lead at the offshore wind energy company Ørsted, and Nicole Herold from the German Association for Negative Emissions. So we've got a good range of views, and hopefully we'll be able to dive into as much as possible in the time that we have. I think, as mentioned, there's a whole jigsaw of regulation here, but I know Europe is particularly advanced in that. But in this mandate, we've come so far, but there's still a lot to be done. The frameworks of kind of the first steps have been laid. I think, Alexandre, I just wondered if you could kick us off by giving a sense or a sort of summation of the overall EU policy, what's been done in this mandate, and what you see as the really key elements of things like the carbon removal framework.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice, and good afternoon, dear colleagues. Happy to be here with you. So in a few minutes to kind of provide a bit of a landscape in terms of the regulatory framework. I mean, you all know this mandate has been big in terms of providing legislation to be fit for 55 and to be on the right path towards climate neutrality. And now the focus is very much on implementation. It is really the most important task that we have ahead of us to implement all this legislation that has been agreed. And on this implementation, I would say, journey, investment, competitiveness is absolutely key. So it is a lot about scaling up technologies that exist. It is a lot about supporting member states in the implementation. So we have the national energy and climate plans, which are absolutely key for providing the right investment framework for member states. It is also a lot about supporting from the public side in terms of the technologies that are not yet mature for being scaled up. So we have then the Innovation Fund in particular that is funded by the ETS. So all of that to really put in place the necessary investment to realize our target. At the same time, we know that any investments need predictability. So when you talk to business, what they really want is to be clear on the path, and that remains stable. And this is why we have also put in a couple of months ago a recommendation for the 2040 target, so that will bring us in a cost-effective way towards climate neutrality. And if we look at this 2040 work that we have done, and including the impact assessment, you will realize that carbon removals play a very important role. We will not be able to reach our climate neutrality objective without this technology to be ramped up. And this is also why we have adopted, at the same time that we had the 2040 communication, a strategy on industrial carbon management. Because we really want to set the vision and also the strategy towards this carbon management to be developed across Europe. And if you look at the numbers, just to maybe also kickstart on this topic, the numbers are quite big. If you look for 2040, we're talking about 400 million tons around of removals, be nature-based or industrial removals, but that's big, and that's really is a challenge, I would say, from a technological perspective. So what is very important is to have in place the right policy framework, regulatory framework. A lot has been done, but not enough, so we will be looking at that again in the next couple of years. what is very important in all these industrial removals is that we have a solution in terms of the storage of CO2. And this is also why we have put this proposal that is now adopted in the context of the Net Zero Industry Act, with the 50 million tons of obligation for storage. First time we put an obligation on the oil and gas industry to really start the work in terms of having the storage capacity available in Europe. So we're very pleased that this legislation could go through so fast, because usually these things take time, but I think we've been quite effective in having this legislation adopted. Now, again, it is about implementing this legislation on NZIA. And just to conclude, the next steps for the next Commission will be to look at 2040 again, so make a proposal for the climate law. And after that, we have a number of reviews in the legislation, be in the EU ETS, LULUCF, so many legislation will be reviewed, and the date set by the co-legislator is 2026. So you will see that things will have to be prepared also in the next couple of months. But just also keeping in mind that, the topic of today is carbon removals, that this will be, of course, a very important element of the policy discussions.
Yeah, and I imagine lots more specific legislation to come underneath the kind of frameworks that have already been set. For example, in the carbon removal framework, there will be delegated acts and so on to...
So in terms of, when you look at NZIA, there is indeed a lot of implementing legislation to still be adopted. It's going to be also quite a short period of time. I think we have 1 year to develop all these acts. So this implementation work will continue. At the same time, we will need to also look ahead.
Sure. Great. I want to bring the others in here now. You mentioned some of the big challenges, the big targets, especially, and a lot of what we see in the Green Deal, of course, is target setting to incentivize, to create markets, and so on. Perhaps, I don't know, Katie, we could start with you just to talk a bit about how you see target setting and the kind of governance that comes behind that as incentivizing the industry and how much that helps.
Yeah. So maybe I'll first just say what my role is in this space, just as context. So I'm from World Resources Institute, so we're a global nonprofit research organization. We're based in DC, but we have offices all around the world. And I focus on carbon removal. WRI broadly focuses on a bunch of different topics at the intersection of climate, nature, and people. But yeah, on your question, I think target setting is critically important to figure out where we're headed and have a consensus idea of where we're headed, and particularly intermediate target setting on the way to that to keep us on track. And one thing we've been thinking a lot about is separate targets for carbon removal and emissions reduction, which I can talk about later. But I think the hard part is how you set that target. And so within that, one thing we've also been thinking a lot about is how that should be done. And ideally, I think it would involve quantification of residual emissions or the hardest to abate emissions. What do we really see carbon removal as counterbalancing? But of course, that's also dependent on how much emissions reductions can happen outside in other sectors of the economy. And that depends on technology development and adoption. So it's really it's very hard to predict that now, and obviously things will change over time. So I think just doing what we can now to lay that out and then iterating over time and revising that over time to make sure we're following the latest developments in emissions reduction.
And I know you've been working on some comparison of US and EU legislation. Do you want to give us just a flavour of that before we move on to how things are comparing? Because obviously the EU has a much more regulatory approach, whereas of course the US has taken a much more kind of money-first approach.
Yeah. So this is a project that WRI has been working on with Carbon Gap, looking at a comparison of US and EU regulation and governance and policy around different types of CDR. So we've done briefs on, which you can find on Carbon Gap's website, on procurement, compliance policy, MRV, et cetera. I think one of the things we've found is that the US has, not surprisingly to most people here, has poured a huge amount of money into research and development and demonstration, deployment support, but has not focused as much on the regulatory development, the MRV standardization that we've seen with the carbon removal certification framework effort in the EU. So I think slightly different approaches. We'll see where each of them end up.
Rodica, I'm sure you would agree with a lot of what was going on there. But yeah, I mean, where do you see particular gaps? Well, maybe introduce carbon gap, of course, a bit, but also talk to us a bit about where there are potential gaps in what the EU has achieved so far.
Thank you. I'm Rodica. I'm from Carbon Gap. We're Brussels-based, but also not only in Brussels-based NGO focusing on scaling up carbon removal in a just and efficient and effective manner. And we very much followed the IPCC dictum that, you need emission reductions, you need carbon removals as well. And therefore, we're trying to be a knowledge partner as much as we can with so many different actors in the ecosystem to try to make sure that we have as much CDR as we need to reach net zero and go even net negative afterwards. Little introduction now regarding the gaps that we've seen. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that a lot has been done, of course, to the point of Mr. Paquot earlier, and we see that the EU is really taking a lead when it comes to regulation, as we said, and CRCF is great, but now it's not done. So all the delegated acts, all the methodologies, and there's so much work that still needs to happen for this whole framework to actually be operational, and we will have a registry in 4 years. So it's a long journey, of course. And it comes with different challenges in terms of uncertainties about certain methods, questions that need to be answered. And here we see a lot of importance for research development and innovation funding. And I'm happy to talk about it a little bit later, maybe in detail. Then gaps in terms of, okay, so we have the CRCF. It is voluntary. It's a great first step, but the big question regarding CRCF, for us at least, was what about uses? What do we do with CDR credits, what units? What do we do with CDR in general, or maybe what we shouldn't do? And that has been an important part of sort of our advocacy throughout the process of the CRCF, and we understand that part of that might and hopefully will be dealt with under green claims when it comes to compensation claims and contribution claims. But still, I mean, we have a new parliament now. We were personally, as Carbon Gap, quite happy with the text of the previous parliament. We hope that it will remain further because certain very strong guardrails, I would say, particularly dealing with the fact that we should not balance in any way fossil fuel emissions that stay for millennia in atmospheres with removals that are not permanent. So that was such an important thing that we only see in the parliament's position. It's not in the council's position, so yeah, that's a little bit of a question, so to say. And then, again, to the point from earlier, okay, we have this voluntary market. What about compliance? And here the question of, do we, integrate CDR directly into ETS? Should we envision something separate that is only targeted to CDR? So yeah, a lot of questions. So I would say implementation the next 5 years, but also probably development of certain policies to further support CDR. That would be the ideal Carbon Gap vision. So yeah.
Great. And I'd love to come back to green claims, which I'm sure a lot of you know is this directive that will govern exactly the kind of what backs up the 100% carbon-free type advertising slogans and so on you see. But David, I wanted to ask you, as a company working in this space, obviously legislation can help, set paths and give some structure, but I guess you're also working far ahead of that in some ways. And how do you, when there's still so much to come, how are you sort of dealing with that push and pull of trying to get ahead, but also anticipating what regulation is to come?
I think that's the excellent question. As a project developer, this is really the thing. You need to look into a business case which needs to function 10, 20, 30 years ahead. So you need to have trust in the mechanisms going forward. And I think uncertainty about regulations, about financing mechanism is really challenging for these kind of projects. We see a lot of projects being ready for FID, which simply doesn't have the funding, don't have the business case to pull it off. So I think targets are really great. They really push politicians, and accountability on targets has been instrumental. In Denmark, we have really good subsidy scheme funding coming out, and that was promoted by politicians being held accountable towards their targets and realizing we cannot reach our targets without carbon removals. So to the degree you can specify the targets that you also need carbon removals, I think that would be great. There's a lot of talk about public funding. That is great to accelerate it, but I think you're mistaken if you think that public funding will drive the sector to the scale we need. So you need to combine funds, and our project was only realized by combining Danish subsidy with voluntary carbon credits. And I think that's a key aspect here. It's how can you, as a project developer, combine different funds, and as regulatory unit, like allow these combinations of funds is really key. You also mentioned of innovation funds, and to push a little bit back, a lot of EU people point to the innovation fund as we can do that and motivate CDRs through the innovation fund. But it's a really resource-intensive process for project developers to go through. So there need to be sector-specific, more agile processes. ETS integration could be interesting. I had a lot of comments on that, but yeah. So to bind these things together, and then a lot of regulatory aspects about claims, certification schemes, and stuff like that. Do you have a credit looking into the future? Is Article 6 going to dismount the entire voluntary market? What buyers can do with these units? Can they not use these units going forward? So yeah, a lot of uncertainties you need to address.
No small task there, indeed. Nicole, of course, you work on the national level, and Germany put out a really interesting negative emission strategy earlier in the year. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a bit about that. And indeed, the targets set in that, some of them very ambitious. What you hope to gain and see by that? Do you think, are they too ambitious? Are they too stretching? Tell us a bit about the thinking there.
So the negative emission strategy that will be that is currently developed. So it's not the process just started. It aims at creating a common understanding on the role of negative emissions for national policy. So there you can see that CDR really climbs up the political agenda in Germany, which is nice to see. And I was actually surprised that they were aiming at really tackling all or a lot of the open questions. So they have they want to set dedicated removal targets. They want they want to look at the market and financial incentives for CDR. So coming up with a proposal there. Also, they want to further fund research and development of CDR methods, and big part is the governance and regulation aspect of CDR, because in Germany at this moment, as probably in all the EU and also in the US, there is no one approach to CDR, given that it's so varied in its methods, and it's currently governed by a whole set of rules. And it's accompanied by permitting procedures that take a long time, and they are unsure if you get the permit. And I liked what was said in a previous panel, that it's really about not falling into a specific category. For example, if you in Germany get your method credited as an agricultural method or a part of agricultural practice, then you can more easily implement it than, for example, ocean-based approaches, because ocean-based approaches in Germany are at the moment prohibited. So it's a very uneven playing field, and the negative emission strategy also aims at pointing out regulatory barriers for CDR in Germany, and then to find a coherent solution for that. That is one very important point in my view, as is the setting of dedicated removal targets, which will then be enshrined in law, so that it's really a law to achieve those targets, and not just a political strategy and declaration of intent, but really a law that the state is obliged to achieve. So that is a development we welcome. And
And how do you feel? Obviously you need to coordinate with EU policy. How does that work in terms of, as you develop this strategy?
So that's of course very important to bear in mind that German regulatory space is heavily influenced by the EU. How that will work in practice, we'll see. So the strategy really is developed right now. So the first workshops will be held in July. It's a broad stakeholder engagement. So the ministry will consult different stakeholders from the industry, but also from science, which is very important to get targets that are based in science and not just politicians thought it would be a good idea to say this is the target, but really have a scientific basis for that.
Right. Alexandre, I don't know if you want to come in on this point about sort of scientifically based targets and how you come up with those, because as I said, one of the interesting things has been some people say, you know, the Green Deal has been far too specific in some of the targets it sets, and actually we should just have this kind of overall, we want to get to net zero by 2050 and everyone will eventually figure it out kind of view. And I wondered, you know, do you foresee much more specific target setting, or do you think that there should be a sort of more setback, let the market do its thing and let the different technologies develop?
Excellent question. I don't know. I mean, we're still going to look into all of these options in the next couple of months and years. This is part of indeed, one of the first discussion under the climate law will be, one single target, net targets, or do we go for, something more complex in the way we design this overall objective? So that's going to be the first point to discuss. But I would say beyond that, what will matter a lot is the, I would say, sectoral legislation, or not the specific legislation, because whatever overall target you set, what matters is really how you decline, or you kind of put that into operation. And one important discussion point will be inclusion or not under the EU ETS. And if so, how? As Rodica was saying, then there will be also a discussion about accounting. And I think what David was saying is very true. We need to have clarity in the way we account these different sources of carbon. And that's not a piece of cake. It's very complex. I can tell you colleagues here in DG Klima are really thinking hard about how to have a system of accounting that works very well. So that's going to be an important element. Now, what I would like also to stress, it has already been referred to, is the carbon removal certification framework. And you said it's a very useful tool. I would say it's a must. It's a prerequisite. You cannot do any policy without a very, very solid MRV system. So having this first building block in place, and I would like to thank the many colleagues who are involved in the design of these methodologies, because we need to make them solid, but also not too complex, because at the end of the day we want to attract investment, so we shouldn't make life also impossible for investors on that. So to find the right balance of what we can cover and how we do it, I think that's a very, very big step. And the colleagues also in DG Klima are working very hard with the expert group to design this methodology. So that's really the first basic element to get these methodologies out. And I can tell you that out of the several aspects we are covering under the carbon removal certification framework, industrial removals will be one of the priority ones. But maybe I stop here, otherwise I want to leave space for...
We could probably spend all day talking about these topics.
No.
Interesting. Katie, I wanted to ask you, Alexandre mentioned getting the right balance, and we do see sort of trust issues in the sector at the moment, because especially communicating it to the public to make them, understand what is a carbon removal, what does it mean, what does it mean to be permanent? What advice would you give to policymakers designing regulation to make sure that we're building a transparent and effective sector?
That's a big question. Maybe two pieces on that. I think on the target setting and then the MRV. And on the target setting, one thing we've been looking at a lot recently at the international level is how countries are thinking about carbon removal in their long-term strategies, which are the documents that they submit to the UNFCCC, generally looking out to 2050. A lot of them contain net zero targets within that, not all of them. They're not all 2050. There's no regulation around what they should include, which I think is part of the issue, but 72 have been submitted so far, so they're not obligatory, but hopefully more will come in later this year. But within those 72, at least I think 26 have mentioned either plans to rely on carbon removal, or they're considering carbon removal and meeting their long-term strategies and their net zero targets within those. But there's very little detail, partly because none is required, about what types of CDR, how much, how they came to the conclusion of how much they'll need, what assumptions they're using, what methodologies. So that's one area where we think more work is needed. And I guess going back to like my point earlier on separate targets, we thought that that is one way to help address some of the concerns that have come up around mitigation deterrence and potential over-reliance on CDR in those long-term targets, which is also a tricky thing to think about when we're like, we have so little CDR today. How can we be thinking about over-reliance in the future? But I think it still is important to think about, given the long-term context of those and the policy signals that those will send. And then, yeah, I guess on the MRV piece, I think, like you said, it's a critical prerequisite that, at least in the US, has not happened really yet. And so WRI actually just published a paper a few days ago on MRV and kind of laying out some of the challenges with the fact that the US has been pouring funding into procurement, into demonstration, but we don't have that kind of consensus MRV framework tied to federal policy. So we think there's an opportunity for that to happen, and one way to help build trust, because I think MRV fundamentally is transparency that can help build trust in the market and provide accountability for claims that are made.
That's really interesting. Nicole, I'm really interested to know what kind of feedback you've already had. And I mean, obviously it's early days, I know, but I just wondered if you've been speaking to some of the companies, KT refers to, and what you've been hearing from them about what you then might put in place, and on transparency, accountability, and so on.
You mean in the strategy?
Yeah,
or?
in developing the strategy.
Of course, a part of the strategy will also be to establish an MRV standard. So they are relying for, as far as I know, they are relying on the findings of the two major research projects on CDR in Germany, which are actually quite big. And they already have worked on MRV, so they are looking at those standards, and they want to develop those standards further along. I think it's important that the industry is included in this dialogue as well, because they have already also a lot of insights they gained in their activities, and they can share with the policymakers to offer a different perspective, and to also see that the industry is doing CDR responsibly and not just claiming credits that do not exist. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly, I do. And of course, all this regulation means, we need money. It's always where it comes down to, and investing. Rodica, I don't know if you could just tell us a bit about where you see financing gaps at the moment, and areas where regulation could help direct investment better, perhaps, or, that kind of perspective.
I'd like to follow up on a few of the other points as well, if that's okay. So first on the target point, just to say that fully in agreement with what you were mentioning regarding separate targets. So we're very happy to see in the 2040 targets communication that, there's this idea of the 90% net reduction emission targets, but we think that absolutely there is a need for the European climate law to be revised to include separate targets between emission reductions and carbon removal, and within that to differentiate also between LULUCF and high durability removals as well. So that would be the one thing that I forgot to mention in the first question, and it was bugging me. Then on the issue of member states, I think as Carbon Gap, because we're primarily, we have a focus on France and a focus on the UK, but mainly we are focusing on the EU level. That's a gap within Carbon Gap. We think that we should do more at member state, because so much that needs to actually come from there. And we were happy in a way to see the conversation on Monday. So there was the Environmental Council, 2040 targets were discussed. There were about 7 member states who already indicated, support for carbon removal, but truly, really a political push has to come from there and from discussing with more member states. And I know there's fantastic civil servants in so many member states trying to do their best to make carbon removal happen. So kudos to everyone, really. And then on the funding, maybe just for context, as Carbon Gap, we put together this vision for an EU CDR strategy, because we're really calling for something that is dedicated to CDR, and it's comprehensive and provides, and not provides, but like covers many facets of how to scale up CDR in Europe, and that would include funding for research development and innovation in early stage. Then, okay, how do you take methods from from lab to field, and how do you bring them to scale? So we're thinking about deployment incentives there, like procurement, for instance, is one of the big sort of ideas that we would like to discuss with everyone. And then further, the question of ETS and RTS and so on. And on the first pillar, so to say, so regarding funding for research development and innovation, we've seen that in terms of gaps, I mean, we've looked at the EU funding mechanism, so we haven't done yet our homework on member states, and it is again a gap within Carbon Gap, and it's on our priority list for this year to look what's happening at the member states level as well. But looking at what is happening at the EU level, purely at Horizon and other frameworks, we've seen that there are certain sort of funding streams that are available for CDR, but often they're not dedicated necessarily to CDR, sometimes only looking at some methods, not all of the methods. So we would really love to see a more portfolio approach where more CDR methods are embraced. And there's a lot of novel CDR methods that are at the very early stage of development, I would say. And ocean CDR were mentioned, enhanced rock weathering, and so on and so forth. And then there's certain questions and research gaps when it comes to the methods that are a little bit more advanced, that ideally would also find an answer through projects funding, through the next framework program, for instance, or other funding streams. And there, on a positive news, so last week, DGRTD put forward a report on the basically priorities for climate technologies and methods that will help the EU achieve net zero, and carbon removal has been identified as one of the several but main priorities for funding for the next sort of framework program, which to us it's a great first step, and we hope that that will materialize in more dedicated and targeted funding for a portfolio of methods. I could speak about procurement, but maybe later.
We can come back. We can come back to procurement, no problem. I wanted to bring David in because you touched on financing earlier, and just how important is it to have a little bit of public financing in order to be able to crowd in more private financing? And where do you see, what sort of concrete things could policymakers do to smooth out some of the issues you have getting projects off the ground?
I think it's a very interesting dilemma to think about. Like we appreciate that the first Danish tender we won was a competitive tender bid. So it was only like competitor. We were competing on the best project and the best price for the CDR. I think that was quite good at getting this industry and the understanding competitiveness between the different actors in Denmark to really up their game and propose, like, think it through, how can we get this project off the ground? So the competitiveness ensure that it's only like mature projects that is going to realize. So that is really driving forward the pushing us project developers to deliver in this case. But in order for this industry to scale, you need certainty in the influx of money and some grander scheme on how the public funding can come in. And on the case of the private funding, I think the uncertainty is definitely what's killing it. I think EU has really appreciate how EU is leaning into this with the certification framework, green claims, really trying to give legitimacy and give the thumbs up for this kind of funding. There is the dilemma, which is really interesting, about when you put regulatory criteria, it becomes not a race to the bottom, but a race to, like, can I just reach this criteria, and then it's all good. Then you have the stamp, and it's nice. So it's good at setting the bottom, the standard. But I think Puro touched upon it like this, getting these competing standards, and we saw the technologies this morning, that different co-benefits. How do you appreciate these co-benefits and different aspects of projects in evaluating these? And when you go to the voluntary carbon market, you can get different price ranges and try to partner up with partners or showcase it in certification schemes and rating agencies, how your project is actually really good and the benefits, and you can get the price premium for that. And I think that's also instrumental to get this diverse group of CDR technologies to blossom and to grow up. And I think to that degree, the distrust is also a benefit. We partnered up with Microsoft in our project for some of the CDRs, and it was great because we could see ourselves in Microsoft. We trust that they are using the credits in a way we can see themselves, and we trust their climate targets. They could see themselves that we are probably the world leader in sustainable biomass and have really great performance in those aspects, and a really great project, we believe. Sorry, but so we saw good benefit in us collaborating on this and building the trust and go out and be proud about our project and to challenge the distrust in the market by showcasing this is how we can do it. This is the premium product you can deliver in this kind of field. And in that way, you can get the extra funding which is needed for these like diverse technologies with different price ranges and different co-benefits. So it's good to have the regulation set the standard, ensure the integrity of the market, but you need to have somehow differentiate in the pricing. And I think that's a big challenge also talking about ETS integration.
Do you find, do you see increasing appetite from investors to get into this market and to back projects, or is there still too much hesitation? Are people beginning to get there? What sort of stage are we?
Yeah, there's a huge appetite to get into it. When you show them price tags, it's lowering, but there's still like an interest in this market, but also like the distrust is really killing it. Like, do they have no certainty about what can they claim? Is this credit worth it? People who come to us value the permanence of the credit, like we can really measure it. The MRV is certain, the additionality is really proven. We don't have a proven BEX methodology yet, so they have to like rely that we can get a certification when we come online next summer. So there's still too much uncertainty in this market, and I think just in general the voluntary carbon market is not mature enough for producing like off-the-scale carbon credits. But so it's still, for the foreseeable future, it will be project and partner specific driving many of these projects.
Yeah. I think interestingly, earlier this week we saw the ministers agree their position on the Green Claims Directive, and it feels very different, especially on the point about carbon credits, from what the Parliament is doing, which is a much more ambitious approach. I just wondered, Alexandre, I don't know if you can answer this, but how the Commission might square that circle when it comes to the final shape of the legislation, and if you could talk to us a bit more about perhaps how the Commission is approaching this issue of trust in the sector and verifying.
Yes. I will not comment on the green claims. This is now between the co-legislators, and it's not directly with us, DG Klima is DG Environment in the lead, so I will not comment on it. But what we are really looking forward is to have clarity and a compromise found between the two institutions, so that indeed companies claiming carbon neutrality or net zero would have clarity on what they can use as credits. And we're quite hopeful that the CRCF units will have a big role there. We really have a big expectation also for the market to be interested in these credits. Also, just to build on what David was saying is that this issue of premium, if you do kind of better in terms of the sustainability elements, this is something that is also built into the carbon removal certification framework. So we will issue credits with units of carbon that are permanently stored, but attached to that there will be also a certificate of compliance. And in this certificate of compliance, we will be looking at providing information on many elements regarding sustainability in particular. So this will be a way for the holder of the certificate to say to the potential seller, look, I've been recognized for this particular benefit in terms of sustainability. So that was a very important element of the Parliament negotiation on the CRCF, to add that element of providing a possible premium. So I hope it can help you in your projects. On the question of trust, as I was saying, MRV, that's absolutely key to have a solid basis in terms of methodologies that is recognized. And on that, I hope really that the CRCF methodologies will tick the box for that.
Great. Yeah, and Katie, I just wondered if you could give us also, from your perspective, a bit more of a flavour of the international. We've seen talks about Article 6 and so on at Bonn. Future ball gazing. Could we see a more international carbon, certification, carbon removal certification system? Could you ever foresee that working, or, give us where does the EU legislation fit within the broader picture as well?
Yeah. Well, I think we know that talks are ongoing around Article 6, and some progress, but not enough, was made at Bonn a few weeks ago. I think. And there are a few other initiatives that are related to carbon removal. There's mission innovation. There's the CDR mission within that. I don't remember how many countries are in it, but it's not every country. There's the carbon management challenge that the US and Canada and a bunch of other countries convened, which I think somewhat unhelpfully conflates CDR and CCS within one target. And there's actually another initiative that I just wanted to mention, because I don't think it got a lot of attention, that was launched at COP28 called the Group of Negative Emitters that Denmark launched. It was kind of a soft launch at COP28, and I think they're planning to do more kind of recruitment at a bigger launch event at COP29, potentially, or later, I don't know. But I think that's a really interesting opportunity so it's Denmark, I think Panama and Finland right now. So obviously very diverse countries in terms of their emissions profile, their natural resources, et cetera. But I think as that potentially grows, it's an interesting opportunity to kind of lay out best practices or norms or some sort of guidance for how countries should be thinking about the role of CDR in meeting their long-term targets, and how that differs based on development status and emissions profile, natural resources, size, all these other factors. So anyway, I'm really interested to see where that will go, and hoping it can play some sort of role there.
No, it's good to see like more initiatives like this coming off the ground, certainly. I think in just the few minutes that we have left, I just wanted to ask a bit more. We see so many fascinating technologies in this space, but I imagine from a regulation point of view, that makes it very difficult because you have to have expertise in all sorts of different things and different ways of doing carbon removals and so on. And I feel like, often from my perspective, we hear about DACs and BECs, but some of the other technologies don't get so much attention. So I don't know if, Alexandre, you could tell us a bit about how you look at the different technologies and how you sort of, try and create regulation that can be applied across them.
It's going to be a step-by-step approach. I think in the methodologies that we are developing, indeed, BECs and DACs play a critical role. We're also looking a lot at biochar, and that's going to be also one of the first methodologies that we will develop. And then we will see also what comes, out of the research and innovation framework, what companies are interested in. So this will be an evolving, I would say, tasks over the years. But let's start with where we know that there is a potential, I would say.
Yeah, start at the beginning. And Rodica, do you see enough knowledge amongst policymakers about all the options that are out there? I mean, do you think there is enough understanding? I'm not just talking about the Commission, but as all the people you speak to of the different technologies.
Difficult to answer as carbon gap, so I will answer as Rodica, if that's fine. I'm personally in awe of the knowledge that DigiClima C3 and DigiClima in general have on this, and I think that it's a lot of progress and a lot of knowledge is there, and I think the challenge is with the Parliament in some cases, and there is a beginning because of course you need to have a file, and the CRCF that was amazing. That's why everyone was like, okay, so let's focus a little bit more on CDR, because before, I don't know, I've been in Brussels for 8 years. 8 years ago, I don't think people were talking in Parliament about CDR. So I think that there's interest. But there's, of course, the need for the entire ecosystem truly to support the policymakers, because, one MEP works on, 7 different things, 20 different things, their assistants as well. So much appreciation for the poor APAs, to be honest, so many things that I need to cover. So again, I would say that there is need for support from the wider ecosystem to be constructive, to be there with, a series of workshops, whatever. We can discuss a lot of ideas, but I would see that it's more on us than on the policy. I mean, it's equal, of course, but it's really that all the NGOs, all the the NEPs, the actors in this space, and of course academia, how can I forget, have an important job to do in supporting the policymakers.
Call to action there. Alexandre, did you want to?
No, I just wanted to say we in DigiClima, even if we build as much as we can knowledge, we rely a lot on the expertise from others, be in industry, NGOs, academia. And that's why our expert group is so important, because that's where we, have really expert discussions. So really a big thank you for what you do, and I would say please continue that. I think we will be closing soon, I guess. I just wanted to tell you that this question of funding is also very much on our radar screen, and we will be organizing at the beginning of next year a workshop, an event around this topic, because we realize that this is, of course, a very, very important element after the MRV to really deploy and scale up this technology. So please follow us on our website and or the social media.
It probably feels like a good place to end, indeed, because I think we could go on into a whole another panel about financing on its own, because it's a fascinating and tricky topic. But yeah, a lot of respect for what you're doing. Thank you all so much for sharing your expertise. I think, if I'm right, there's a short coffee break, and then no, we're straight into the next panel. So bear with, we'll just do a quick changeover. But thank you so much, and thank you to my panelists.